Okay, so now what we're going to be talking about is how interest groups go ahead and try and affect policy. You know, they use these lobbyists, they hire these lobbyists to go and represent their interests in Washington, D.C., in the Capitol, in Sacramento. And so we're going to talk about two different strategies. We're going to spend more time talking about the second strategy, but the first strategy is important to know. It's just a little bit easier to understand. And that is, we're going to talk about the inside game and then the outside game, two different strategies. So here's the way the inside game works. And when we're talking about inside, we're kind of talking about like inside the government, inside the halls of Congress, or inside the White House, or inside the Federal Trade Commission, wherever it happens to be. This is when lobbyists go ahead, and what they do is they make direct contact with policymakers. They actually knock on the door, right? Hey, can I talk to Congressman so-and-so? Or can I talk to his chief of staff? Or can I talk to somebody, you know, on the committee? Something like that, where they're making direct contact with the policymakers. Now, this strategy of the inside game, using this strategy of where lobbyists go and they talk directly with the policymakers, that works best when the issues that are being debated or discussed or voted on or whatever are very narrow and very technical. So, for example, after the financial crisis that happened in 2008 and then the beginning of 2009, there was a great deal of discussion about regulating something called credit default swaps. Now, if you don't know what credit default swaps are, don't worry, because probably 2% of the population, maybe even less, understand what credit default swaps are. And when I first heard about credit default swaps, I had no idea what it meant. I thought, I know what credit means, I know what default means, I know what swap means, but I've never heard those words put in that order. I'm not even going to bother explaining it to you. The point is when they started to debate this and discuss in committees how they were going to go ahead and regulate credit default swaps, they talked about this in Congress, they talked about it in the White House. Lobbyists went and made direct contact with policymakers to tell them what they thought they should do, how they thought the policy should be established. You can do that when the issues being debated are something very narrow and very technical, and where the public has very limited amount of information. Direct contact with policymakers can actually work really well. So that's when they use the inside game. When Congress or the president are debating policies that are very narrow and very technical, where the public doesn't have a lot of information. Now, then there's the outside game. And the outside game is different. I have to scroll my notes here. When interest groups use the outside game, it's not that they're hiring lobbyists to go ahead and go talk to the people, like to the leaders. What they're going to do in this case is they're actually going to talk to their members, the people who belong to the group. So, for example, the National Rifle Association, the NRA, has millions of members. And if a bill is being debated that has something to do with gun control or gun safety, one of the things that they might do is use the inside game. Go ahead and hire some lobbyists to go knock on the doors of the policymakers and say, hey, look, we want to talk to you about this law that's coming up that's being proposed. But sometimes what's more effective, and what they prefer to do, is to go ahead and use the members of the NRA, all the people, the millions of people who belong to the NRA, to go ahead and pressure their policymakers. So they might send out an email to everybody saying, call Congressman so-and-so and let him know that you don't like this bill. Or sometimes they'll go ahead, and they've done this in the past, where they'll go ahead and they'll say, call up Congressman, don't email him, call him up. Right? And then sometimes they'll even, and this is sort of like the outside game and the inside game, but sometimes they'll say, go march on the, march on the Capitol, or go ahead and flood Washington, D.C. and go knock on their doors. So, but the idea is that what they're doing is they're trying to use their members to go ahead and knock, sort of bug policymakers to do what they want them to do. The inside game, they hire lobbyists who go and knock on the doors and talk to them. Again, those usually work on those narrow and technical issues. But when they use the outside game, they're going to go ahead and they're going to get the members of their organization to go ahead and contact the policymakers and bug them. And by the way, members of Congress do care when they get phone calls. I've had many students who are interns who worked for members of the House, they worked for senators, and they keep track of every phone call that comes in, what the person on the phone wanted, what they were upset about, what they were concerned about. So, if you're ever pissed off and there's some reason to call, not like a friend, but you're pissed off about something the government has something to do about, go ahead and call your congressman, and they will care. They will listen. Not them, their staff. Now, the other approach that the interest groups is where they try and, instead of affect members of Congress, they try and shape public opinion. They try and shape public opinion. And there are two strategies for this. Sometimes what interest groups will do is go ahead and use what's called the paid media. And then sometimes they'll use what's called the free media. So I want to talk about the distinction between the two. The paid media is basically when you're paying to get your message out, right? You're paying to get your message out. And so that usually comes in the form of commercials or advertisements in a newspaper, where an interest group might be opposed to a certain policy, and so they go ahead and they take out an ad, or they in a paper, or they buy some commercial time and put it on TV. If you look on your lecture notes, what you'll see is there are two links to two different commercials. One was from 1993. It was referred to as the Harry and Louise commercial, and it was run by people who were opposed to the health care reform proposals of the Clinton administration. The second one is called Harry and Louise Return. It ran in 2008. And in this case, in this version of it, the Harry and Louise are a little bit older. What is that? 15 years older. And they look at. And now, in this case, in Harry and Louise Return, now they've flipped sides, and now these actors are on the side of healthcare reform. So what I want you to do is go ahead and pause this, and then go ahead and flip on first Harry and Louise, the first one, 1993, then Harry and Louise Return, 2008. So pause while I yawn. Did you pause? Pause and go watch the stuff. Okay, so I'm assuming you've come back. So you can see that the commercials were very similar, right? This is what interest groups do. They try to shape public opinion. In the first one, there were a lot of people who said that the Harry and Louise commercials were very influential in turning the public against the healthcare reform that the Clintons had proposed. I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that, but that is what people say. Now, there are certain advantages to using the paid media, right? So I want to talk about, and disadvantages. In terms of the advantage, well, let's do the disadvantage first. The big disadvantage of going ahead and using the paid media is that it's really expensive. You know, TV time, advertisements, things like that, they're all very expensive. So you've got to be an interest group that has some money in order to go ahead and pursue that strategy. But the big advantage has to do with content, the actual stuff that you show. You totally get to control what's shown. If you're doing a Harry and Louise commercial, you're paying for the thing, right? So you get to decide what the actors look like. You get to decide what the kitchen looks like. You get to decide what they're going to say. You get to decide the music that's in the background. You get to decide everything, and no one can mess with it. That's the key about the paid media. The paid media, it's expensive. That's the disadvantage. It costs you some money to go ahead and do it. But the advantage is you get to control the content that you're putting out there. You get to control your message. That's the paid media. Now, next, in the next video, we'll start off talking about the free media.